Kia ora class. Today we're going to be talking about the biomechanical principle of projectile motion. First of all, what is a projectile? A projectile is anything that is propelled through the air. It's an object flying through the air. For example, a basketball when it's shot at the hoop, a javelin after it's thrown in the air, or sometimes the human body could become a projectile. For example, when a diver jumps off a diving board through the air. Three main factors determine the path of a projectile, and we use the word trajectory to describe the path of a projectile. The first factor that influences the path of a projectile is the angle of release. The angle of release refers to the angle between the trajectory of the projectile and the ground at the point at where it's released. The optimum angle of release is nearly always 45 degrees. This gives the projectile the best balance between flight time and distance travelled. We use the term vertical displacement to describe the distance it travels from where it starts. So we can visualize angle of release like this. Say we're starting at a fixed point here, and we have a low angle of release. The projectile will stay relatively close to the ground and hit the ground again pretty soon, won't have a lot of flight time. However, if we have a very, very high angle of release, then the projectile is going to go up and come down. It'll have a lot of flight time, but it won't have very much distance or vertical displacement. However, if we use the optimum angle, which is approximately 45 degrees, you'll see that the trajectory of the projectile is much, much better. Get a lot more distance, a lot more flight time. So how does angle of release affect performance? Changing the angle of release may help you increase the success of a skill in the following ways. It might help you get the projectile over an obstacle. It might give the projectile more flight time if that's what your skill needs. It could give the projectile more distance, that is, more vertical displacement. And it could ensure that you are efficient and don't have to put in more force than needed into your shot. If you get the angle of release wrong and you're aiming at a target, you may have to put in much more force to get it there. But if you get the angle of release right, you're going to put in the minimum amount of effort, which is kind of what we're aiming for. Next, we're going to talk about speed of release. This is how much speed a projectile has as it leaves contact with the ground, or leaves whatever is contacting the ground. For example, your human body, it leaves your arm. Generally, the more force you put into a projectile, the more it accelerates, and that means the more speed it has when it leaves your hand or leaves the ground. Now if we visualize speed of release, we can think about it like this. Again, starting from a fixed point, we're going to keep the angle of release the same. We're going to keep it at approximately 45 degrees. Okay? With a low speed of release, the trajectory is going to be quite a small arc like this. Cool? If we increase the speed of release, the arc is just going to grow in size. The angle doesn't change, but the size of the arc does, the trajectory. Again, we're going to increase the speed of release again, more power, more speed as the projectile leaves, and you can see the arc has increased in size again without actually changing shape. So how does speed of release interplay with performance? Changing the speed of release may help you increase the success of a skill in the following ways. It might help in getting the projectile to its destination faster. It might help by giving the projectile more distance. Again, that's called vertical displacement. It might help by enabling you to hit the target with more force when it reaches it. The last factor we're going to talk about is height of release. This is how high or low a projectile is when it starts its flight in relation to the target. It might start above the target or it might start below the target. The higher the height of release in relation to the target, the more flight time it's going to have, and thus the more distance it can reach away from where it started. And finally, visualizing height of release. We're going to keep the speed of release and the angle of release the same, We're going to start from this point here, 45-degree angle of release. We can see the trajectory will look something like this for a given speed. Cool. Now we're going to increase the height of release. We're going to put the point of release here. We're going to keep that angle the same, 45 degrees. And we're going to imagine that the speed is the same as well. So the curve will look mostly the same, except when it gets to here, obviously it carries on a bit until it hits the ground. So you can see with an increased height of release, we've been able to get the air time and thus the vertical displacement, the distance, even further. So how does height of release interplay with performance? Changing the height of release may help you increase the success of your skill in the following ways. It might help you get over an obstacle. It can sometimes get the projectile closer to its target if the target is above the starting position of the projectile. It might give the projectile more flight time and therefore enable it to go further if that's what you're aiming for. And that's how projectile motion might affect various skills in terms of biomechanics.